Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Baker Institute. My name is Ron Sass, and I'm a fellow at the Baker Institute and a trustee of the Nature Conservancy. And it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Laura Huffman, the Executive Director of the Nature Conservancy of Texas. A native of Austin, Texas, Laura Huffman is both an Aggie and a Longhorn, having earned an undergraduate degree in political science from Texas A&M University and a Master of Public Affairs degree from the University of Texas at Austin. She served as Deputy City Manager of San Marcos from 1994 to 2002 and Assistant City Manager of Austin from 2002 to 2008, spearheading important watershed protection and economic development initiatives in both cities. As Executive Director of the Nature Conservancy, Laura leads a network of scientists, conservation experts, and a staff that supports 35 preserves across Texas. Under Huffman's leadership, the organization has significantly extended the land, marine, and freshwater conservation work and has helped expand important state and city parks. Laura has spoken at a number of conferences, including the inaugural South by Southwest Eco Conference in 2011, the Texas Tribune Festival, and the statewide Land Conservation Conference, and has authored articles and op-ed pieces for every major newspaper in Texas. Most recently, she worked closely with Texas legislature to draft 2 pieces of legislation with far-reaching ramifications on water conservation. Laura is the recipient of the 2011 Austin Business Journal Women of Influence Profile and Power Award, which recognizes successful businesswomen who actively contribute to the better, brighter Austin community, and serves on the board of directors of the Texas League of Conservation Voters. Please join me in welcoming Laura Huffman, State Director of the Nature Conservancy, who will address you on water as and not an option, Texas' broken promise to future generations.
All right. Thank you for that generous introduction. I want to talk a little bit before I start my remarks about the pictures that you're going to be seeing on this slideshow. There's not going to be very many words on them. In fact, there are going to be no words on them. And the reason I do this is because I think it's so important when we're talking about conservation and the environment to remind ourselves that there is nothing conceptual about this. This is about real places and real people. And so often when we talk about the policies that sit behind conservation, particularly in the arena of water and energy and land, it becomes a concept. And so I do this just as a gentle reminder to you all as an audience that the problems that we're solving are real problems that happen in real places and affect real people. So my comments tonight are about a topic that is quickly becoming the proverbial elephant in the room. It involves a set of resources that all of us depend on. And without this, businesses cannot function, families cannot function, cultures fall apart. It is something that is so incredibly basic to all living things that we just have to take a step back and address it. And of course, that issue is water. So that's what we're going to talk about. Now, the Nature Conservancy has been working on water issues all over the world. And for those of you that don't know, we work in all 50 states and we work in 35 countries. So the comments that I'm going to make tonight represent our perspective as a whole organization on the issue of water. And I also want to give credit to my Texas team because it represents a lot of intellectual capital and a lot of experience from the staff at the Nature Conservancy right here in Texas. Let me give you 3 basic numbers that you just have to keep in mind when you're thinking about freshwater protection. 97% of all the water on the earth is salty. So when you're looking at a globe and it looks like a big wet planet, you just have to remember that 97% of that water is salty. 2.5% is locked in ice. We are fueling the entire world, our economies, our cultures, our families, with the 0.5% of water that's left. And here's the other thing you need to know about that water. We have the same amount of water on the planet today as we did 1,000 years ago. So when you're thinking about water, you have to think about it as a fixed asset, because that's what it is. And if you combine that set of facts with just one more set of facts, you've got the basic context for this discussion. The world's population is growing and growing quickly. Right now we're at 7 billion people, and in 50 years we'll have 9 billion people on this planet. In Texas, we've got a very similar growth pattern. We're at 25 million people today, and in 50 years, there will be 50 million people living in our state. And what's interesting about water, unlike a lot of complicated issues where you can't really figure out what happens if you do nothing, we know exactly what will happen if we do nothing in water. We actually have a crystal ball. We can see the future with water. Think about these statistics. In the last century, global water use has been growing at more than twice the rate of population. The World Bank reports that 80 countries now have water shortages that threaten health and economies, and 2 billion people today do not have access to appropriate clean water supplies. 2 billion people. Over 1.4 billion people on this planet live in river basins where the amount of water that we're using exceeds the world's ability to recharge those river basins. In other words, we're draining rivers on this planet right now. And here in Texas, the actual cost of doing nothing has been calculated. This summer, the state of Texas updated its water plan, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And what it said is the cost of not implementing this plan is estimated to be about $116 billion a year by the year 2060, which of course would sink the state's economy. And as we stand here today, there are 16 communities in Texas right now, 16 communities that have a water supply of less than 6 months. The statistics show you the canary is in the coal mine, and we're there with it. Something just has to be done. In fact, the statistics in this arena are so dramatic that the real question it begs from my perspective is, why haven't we done something? What crisis do we need that would make this even more dramatic in order to motivate us to act? And here's the way I put these big numbers into perspective. 50 years ago, our state experienced what's called the Drought of Record. And really all that means is it's the worst drought we had seen. And following that Drought of Record, big thinkers made big decisions. The leaders of the day said, not only are we not going to let this happen again, we're not going to let this happen again for others. And they used every tool that they had at their disposal to make investments all over this state in order to guarantee the state's future. They built dams and reservoirs. They had contingency plans for droughts. They cultivated new water resources. They invested in order to protect the state's future. They took action. Well, here we are today, 50 years later, and those investments have reached the end of their time. For one, our state is significantly bigger. During the Drought of Record, we had fewer than 10 million people living in the state of Texas. Today, we have 25 million people here. So our ability to pull out of a drought today is fundamentally different than it was in the 1950s. In just 30 years, here's the way I think about this, and I think probably the way a lot of you think about these kinds of issues. In 30 years, my oldest daughter will be my age. And so the question that I ask myself is this. Look, our kids are going to look back at this year and they will note something. We had a record year in terms of heat, drought, and wildfires. This is a year that will make history for those reasons alone. And a generation from now, our kids are going to look back and ask the question, did we think big? Did we take these incredibly dramatic conditions? Did we look at the statistics at hand? And did we act on those things? Now, here's where we are. It's pretty dramatic. But for those of you that don't know the Nature Conservancy, we're perfectly comfortable painting a really grim picture as I just did, partly because we come right back in and talk about solutions. And that's what I want to do, because it is important for people to understand the context for water. We're in a bad situation, and a good rain won't fix it. It really won't. But in order to solve against the problem of water for a growing state, there are really three basic strategies that will help solve that problem. First, we have to manage the limited supplies of water that we have better. We have to manage those existing supplies for a growing population. Second, we have to drive water use down everywhere, from homes to businesses. Less will have to be more, or at least enough. And third, we've got to work very hard to protect water quality. We simply cannot afford to spoil that which cannot be replaced. So it's all about managing supplies, driving use down, and guaranteeing quality. These are the major strategies that will be at work all over the world. What I'm going to talk about is how they can act specifically in our state in order to guarantee our future. So first, let's talk about managing limited water supplies. Texas, interestingly, is in a slightly better position than many places all over the world because we do have a state water plan. Our legislature put together a process that was actually pretty good. It divided the state into regions, and it asked those regions to take a look out into the future, think about what population for the region was going to look like over a 50-year horizon, and then to articulate what it would take in order to plan for the future of water. Now, here's what's interesting about that. The cost to design and construct that plan is $53 billion. By the way, the cost of that plan has gone up considerably. If I had been giving this speech a year ago, the cost was $31 billion. So part of the cost of waiting and part of the cost of doing nothing is the price tag goes up. So beyond that $53 billion price tag, the other number that gets the Nature Conservancy's attention is that 23% of our future water supply is scheduled to come from something called conservation. So now you've got the basic graph of what's happening in Texas. We've got population doing this, we've got water as a fixed asset, and we've got a state plan that is counting on all of us to use less, a whole lot less. Here's the problem. The problem is the state hasn't funded the water plan. The problem is that there's no game plan for achieving that 23% conservation number. So we're a state that has a plan, a set of ideas, articulated projects, something we might even want to argue about at some point, but there's no funding for that plan. So where do we go from here? Where do we go from here in a world of limited resources? First of all, I always like to head towards low-hanging fruit first. And here's where the low-hanging fruit is with money. For years, the state has funded a series of programs throughout the state that invest in water, wastewater, and drainage projects. These are loan programs and grant programs. In fact, if you voted on November 8th, and hopefully you did, you were part of a group of people that extended the state's lending authority to a grand total of $6 billion. Now, if you were to look at the programs that sit beneath that, they're all important. There's nothing there that doesn't matter. But the question is, what's the most important? In a state with a state budget crisis, in a state with a water plan that has been identified as the #1 priority, why wouldn't we take every one of those dollars and just go back to zero-based budgeting and make sure that every dollar was going towards solving this $53 billion problem? It's an easy first step. In fact, it's really part of compliance and alignment when you think about it. The state legislature has articulated and passed a plan. We need the existing agency funding and programming to match that plan. I consider that low-hanging fruit. And by the way, if we were to do that, that $6 billion would represent the first basic block of investment in the state's water plan. And here's why the state has a stake in this. I've told you the $53 billion number. Local communities, local utilities, like your utilities here in Houston, are counting on the state to help implement these projects to the tune of $27 billion. So we already know what utilities are asking the state to pay for in terms of this plan. So first, take the money that's there and align it. The second thing, and this is really a statement of the obvious at this point, but even if you did that, even if you aligned every one of those $6 billion towards the water plan, you still would not have adequate funding. And so the bottom line is we are going to have to invest in the water plan with a permanent revenue stream. Otherwise, this is just ideas on paper. And those ideas get more and more expensive every year. So the way that I look at it is, yes, this is going to cost real people real money. That's what this is about. And rather than debating whether or not we should pay for it, I think the question that we have to ask ourselves is, if not us, then who? Well, if not us, it's our children and their children, because 50 million people are going to want access to clean water, and as we stand here today, we know they won't have it unless this plan is implemented. That is the strategy for managing water use in Texas today. That's how we're going to take the supplies of water that we have and stretch them into a population that's twice what it is today. So let's talk about that 23% number. How are we going to drive water use down? This is one, I'm going to talk to you about this one from two different perspectives, because this is an area where we could either have a lot of fights or avoid a lot of fights, because every one of these is potentially controversial. But let's start here. Our businesses, our families, our industries, everybody, agriculture, everybody is going to have to use less water. And the quickest way to reduce that is to eliminate waste. The estimates for municipal and agricultural water use, which by the way is about 90% of all the water that's used, run from 5 to 30%. That's unimaginable. In a state that is counting on water shortages, letting it leak through drippy pipes and letting it evaporate through bad irrigation systems is an unimaginable waste, and it's an easy place to start. So let's start with ag. 60% of all the water that's used in Texas is used to grow food. And here I want to talk about a way that I think the Nature Conservancy does a particularly nice job in framing issues versus how we've all become used to issues getting framed. One way to talk about agricultural water use is to talk about who's growing what and where and why, right? And we're used to that, particularly with rice farming in Texas and other kinds of production in Texas. But the truth of the matter is, this growing population is going to want to do three things: drink clean water, eat food, and turn the lights on. So it does us no good to pit one of those things against the other. And water is exactly a place to start. The global estimates for water loss in agriculture are 30%. It's the highest loss rate of any use for water. So if 60% of the water is going to grow food and the loss is there at 30%, that is a terrific place to start. And we know exactly what's going on there. How many of you have driven down a Texas highway and seen those big center spigot irrigation systems with water going around in a circle? Everybody, I'm sure, if you've lived in Texas long enough. Well, it turns out that those systems waste an enormous amount of water. And when you combine that with the channels that are moving water around, and the fact that most of those are unlined, which means the water is seeping right back into the ground, that's where the water losses are, and technology is already available to solve that problem. There are irrigation systems today that are available that detect the moisture levels in the soil and will provide the water where and when it's needed versus on a timed schedule wherever the circle lands. And one thing that we could easily accomplish is to work with the agricultural industry in Texas, take those loan programs that already exist at the state and either loan the money at reduced interest rates or use a grant incentive program and work with the agricultural industry to replace those old irrigation systems with the kind that don't have so much waste. That's 30%. It's worth our attention and it's worth the state's money. It's worth incenting, in my view. The benefits to the state, of course, are that it regains valuable water supply. The benefits to the agricultural community are that they are saving money on a natural resource, and also it turns out that modern irrigation systems help with crop productivity. So there's just nothing but a win-win in that situation. The next area is energy. And this has been an emerging conversation for years, but here's the truth of the matter. Water and energy go together. Most energy sources require an enormous or at least some amount of water. And of course, fracking and natural gas requires a lot of water, and since it's on the top of everybody's mind with energy, we may as well just put it on out there. But the other side of that formula is this. It is incredibly expensive from an energy perspective to treat water. Energy is typically one of the most expensive ingredients in water treatment. So the two just go together. Here's what's interesting. I've already said this. We've got a water plan for Texas. It goes 50 years out. It looks at population. It suffers from one fatal flaw, which is that it's wholly unfunded, but at least we've got a plan. In energy, we have billions of dollars being invested all over the state in a whole variety of energy sources, and no plan. No plan. So we have a plan with no money, and we have a money with no plan. And the problem with that is those two things are so dependent on one another that we can't continue along that path. And the fix there is relatively easy. We just have to develop an energy plan for the state of Texas, if for no other reason than the fact that we've got to be able to understand where the water will be needed in order to produce energy for the future. And I'll say this. The other piece of that energy plan is, energy is about achieving a balanced portfolio. There are very, very few major cities, at least in this country, that rely on a single source of energy. So when we're talking about an energy plan at the Nature Conservancy, we're not talking about picking one source of energy over another. What we're talking about is a responsible, balanced energy portfolio that manages risks across 5 basic factors: cost, reliability, and impact separately to air, land, and water. And the truth of the matter is there's no one source of energy that wins on all 5 fronts, and therefore you're managing risk with an energy policy. And of course the risk that I'm focused on today is water, but there are others. There are others. An energy plan goes a long way to helping with this. So, continuing down the use path, cities. Water use in cities is where the growth is happening. Nearly half of the water in the state of Texas will be serving a city by the time this water plan is fully implemented in 50 years. And any losses in a municipal environment are unimaginable. And in some cities, they're quite large. So eliminating water losses in cities is incredibly important. The other thing that's important for cities to do is to consider reuse or gray water. Understanding how that can be used as an industrial water supply. It can also be used for irrigation. That is less expensive water, and it is also a way to conserve and reuse this natural resource. And that's going to be important in our cities because 85% of the state's population is going to be living in one of our major Texas cities. So anything we can do in that environment is going to be important. And the last one is really just the spirit of the thing. We're going to have to motivate people everywhere to use less. Conservation can't be a movement when it comes to water. Conservation is going to have to become a way of life. And what I think is really sort of interesting is that there are some corporate early adopters that are already showing us what this could look like. And as I read through a couple of these examples, you will recognize immediately why these people are early adopters. Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola has a partnership with the Nature Conservancy that we call the Zero Water Footprint Policy. So for every drop of water that's used in a can of Coke, their commitment is to replace that somewhere on this planet. Now, as a major beverage organization, I get it. They need nothing more than they need clean, reliable sources of water. Levi Strauss just came out with zero water blue jeans. How cool is that? And they're sewing tags into blue jeans that are encouraging people to wash them less and wash them in cold water to save energy. The Hershey Company has designed metrics around everything, including all of their air quality issues and also reducing water usage. And they're going to their supply chains and asking them to do the same thing. PHMSA, which is one of the largest bottlers in Latin America, has a nice partnership with the Nature Conservancy where they're investing millions and millions of dollars in protecting watersheds. These are the early adopters in freshwater protection, and what I think is so encouraging about that is that this is the type of thing that makes conservation cool, it makes it mainstream, and the fact of the matter is our success will depend on these kinds of creative partnerships. And the last area is guaranteeing that water quality is protected. This is probably the most traditional space for the Nature Conservancy. But there's no question, protecting the quality of water that is in our rivers and streams and lakes and aquifers is incredibly important. That is what serves and provides all of the biodiversity for the planet, including us. So if something were to compromise the quality of water in our rivers and streams, it would be devastating to our environment, devastating. It would also put us at risk, because when those bodies of water become dirty and they become harder to clean, they're just coming to us, and we've got to spend more money on treatment systems to clean it up so that it can go to families and homes and businesses. So even if you didn't have an environmental interest in keeping rivers and streams clean, there's an economic interest that sits right behind that. Okay, so the simplest way to make sure that the rivers and streams are clean is to protect the land on which those drops of water first fall and that go straight into our aquifers. And that is fundamentally the relationship between land protection and water protection. They're completely interrelated. One of the things that we've done in the Nature Conservancy is to work on what we call water protection funds. These have been extraordinarily popular in parts of Texas already. In San Antonio and the counties between San Antonio and Austin, these are citizen initiatives. People get to go to the ballot, they vote, and typically they vote in huge patterns. 60-65% people love these programs, and they're investment programs in the protection of the aquifers and the surface water that these cities depend on to serve their populations. And they're incredibly effective by going in and targeting land over aquifers and either working with private property owners on conservation easements or by buying the land fee simple, we're able to achieve real live protection. In fact, in San Antonio, 21% of the aquifer has been protected through these programs. Since 1997, that set of communities, that region of Texas, has invested $500 million in protection. That's the kind of best practice that can be shipped all over this state. In fact, that's the kind of best practice that can be shipped all over the world. And it is the leading strategy in Latin America for protecting watersheds. That is exactly what PHMSA is funding, is more and more and more of those water protection funds. The other thing that we just absolutely have to continue doing is in-stream flows protection. The state of Texas has done two really nice things as long as they're implemented. We've talked about the water plan, but the other one protects in-stream flows in the major rivers in Texas. And what that process simply does is it evaluates from a scientific perspective, and this is where organizations like the Nature Conservancy have really nice science to help, how much water is required in this river to protect the basic ecosystem and to protect the bays and estuaries. Here's why that matters, since we're right here in Houston. Texas is the drainage base. Texas drains straight into the Gulf of Mexico. The Gulf of Mexico is our drainage basin. So everything that's happening in the rivers and streams in Texas will ultimately be felt in the Gulf of Mexico. So the fact that the state has a program that's set up to identify the flow regimes, how much water is needed, in order not just to protect those specific rivers, but to protect the Gulf of Mexico, is really a nice best practice. In fact, it's one of the things that we try to get in place in other states. And for those of you that don't immediately see the connection between freshwater and the Gulf, here's why we care about the Gulf of Mexico, other than the fact that it's part of our cultural heritage. The Gulf of Mexico is an extraordinarily significant source of domestic oil and gas production for the United States. It is a huge economy for the fisheries. People eating shrimp and shellfish and even fish in the United States are often eating it straight from the Gulf of Mexico. It is a tourism dynasty. In fact, if you were to take the Gulf of Mexico and calculate it as an economy, it would be the 14th largest economy in the world. It's worth protecting, and making sure that the rivers and streams that flow into the Gulf of Mexico are clean is an incredibly important first step. So, managing the supplies that we have well, driving water use down in every single arena, and making sure that we do everything possible to keep those supplies clean for the ecosystems in which they live, but also for the people that are going to be relying on those water supplies. Those are the things that we have to do, and do really, really well as a state. And here's what I think about. Again, 50 years ago, state leaders were crawling out of a drought. It had been devastating, not just to the economy of Texas, but to the landscape as well. And there were so few people living in the state as a relative matter, fewer than 10 million people. Think about 25 million straws in our rivers and streams and lakes and aquifers. That's where we stand today. And I've outlined some here today. The strategies are out there. We know enough about technology. We know enough about how to solve problems, including water quality problems and water quantity problems. Look, we know how to design rate structures that would turn everybody in Houston, Texas into a conservationist just to get a cheaper water bill. We know how to do these things. The question is whether or not we've even got the right structures in place in order to really, really take action. And we know what some of the old structures look like. And I'll just make a couple of suggestions, because I think all the good ideas in the world become problematic if you can't put wheels on them and drive them someplace. So a question that I've asked myself is, why don't we have a drought commission? We just came out of one of the most significant droughts in our state's history, and we don't have a group of people that has been identified to think through the immediate ramifications as well as the long-term solutions. But we wouldn't want this to just be the traditional kind of commission. You would definitely need elected officials. There's no question about it. But instead of going down party lines, and then we know what happens, the whole thing breaks immediately, we want to pick people that come from urban interest and rural interest, because those are where the differences are with water. And we want to pick people that have real water experience and water planning in their backgrounds. And you just have to have corporations. First of all, you've got some nice early adopters out there that have a proven track record. And second of all, they're going to be part of the buy-in that is necessary to make some difficult decisions. And I think you need to have thought leaders. You need organizations like the Nature Conservancy, which is a science-based organization. We're just calling balls and strikes that provide solutions. There are some wonderful elite foundations in Texas that have a very proven track record of investing in the state's water future. That's the kind of group that we need to come together. I mean, consider it a water security consortium for the future. People that have a bias towards action, that have enough brains and enough nonpartisan support to really put wheels on this idea. And they're there. They're there. And they don't all actually require any federal. And in some cases, the ideas don't require state. And in some cases, they really don't require local action. These ideas and this problem are going to have to be solved beyond the boundaries of government. It's going to take people like us investing in solutions. I'll end where I started. We have the crystal ball. And by creating these supplies, by driving use down, and by protecting water quality, and by insisting on structures that will make this happen, we can get there. We can get there. The summer was actually sort of useful. It was hard to say that in the summer after, 80 days in a row of plus 100 temperatures. Half the state was on fire and we hadn't had rain in a long time. But it was useful because it showed us exactly what we're facing, and it got people's attention. And I'll say this, it showed us what the cost will look like. There were $5.2 billion of losses this summer in the agricultural sector alone. So we really have started to see what the cost of doing nothing will look like for our state. Not to mention the fact, if you've driven around the state of Texas, it's had devastating impacts on our landscapes. So I'm going to pause for a minute and take questions, but I would like to just recognize the people in this room and to say to you that, there are lots of big, complicated problems in this world. You've got energy, you've got healthcare. I mean, we're swimming in big, complicated problems. And here's how those conversations typically go. You know, people, it's easy to identify problems and it's easy to start sorting through solutions. The question is always who? And it's rooms like this. If you look around this room, you know, you're the intellectual capital of this city. You've got the youth in here. You've got community leaders in here. I see several foundations in here and nonprofits. I even see the media in here. It is rooms like this that can make a decision that we will change the course. We will change the course. The cost of not doing so involves borrowing against our children's future, and I don't think there's anybody out there that would do that knowingly. So, it's time to act. Let me pause there and take questions.
To what extent are you including global warming in your plans?
To a huge extent. To a huge extent. I mean, it's an issue that you can talk about, you know, more candidly in some places than in others. But even if you look at what climatologists are saying in the state of Texas, we're not coming out of this one-year drought next year. They're already predicting that it will go into the future. And so there's no question that Texas as a state is going to be drier and hotter. Sadly, last summer might become closer to the norm.
Thank you. The climate scientist I follow most closely estimates it's only a matter of decades till this past summer is the norm.
Yeah. It's important to recognize that, of course, the flip side of that is flooding will become more of a feature in other parts of the country. You know, if we were living along the Mississippi, we might be having a different kind of conversation right now. Actually, we would be having a different kind of conversation right now.
If you think about everything in terms of demand, supply, and price, we have an interesting anomaly with water over the fact that it's thought of as being fairly cheap, if not remarkably cheap. There was an article in the New York Times reviewing the Los Angeles water problem approximately 20 years ago. They interviewed the chief of water for the Los Angeles water system. And one of his remarks was quite instructive. I'd like to get your comment on it. He, at the end of the article, they quoted him as making the statement after sweeping his hand to the west, referring to the Pacific Ocean and all the salt water, that all they had done is run out of cheap water. They hadn't gotten into the expensive water. And of course, at that time, Los Angeles had a couple of projects, maybe not very large projects, to desalinate water. Could you share with us your thoughts on that, A, and B, has anyone done any work to look at the price at which water becomes economical to draw from the oceans? Thank you.
You bet. I think I'm going to build desal into this speech because that's usually the first or second question every time. Let's go back to some of these basic facts because I worry about the inclination to say, let's go to the 97%. And the reason I worry about that a little bit is because it's extraordinarily expensive to build those desal plants. And they're also going to be far more useful in cities like Houston that are close to those supplies than they're going to be to cities like Dallas who have to build extraordinarily expensive pipelines in order to move the water to their cities. So the big issue with desal right now is the cost. It is cost prohibitive, although there are desal plants all over the world, and we've got some in Texas. Corpus Christi has a desal plant. El Paso has a desal plant. The cost of the technology would come down. It will. But here's what I worry about with people that point to that and say, we've already got the solution. Look, we've already got 2 billion people that don't have access to clean, potable water supplies. That tells you a little bit about what's happening with the cost of water. If we can't serve 2 billion people today, step one shouldn't be to create even more expensive water. I think the math there is pretty easy. We will use desal plants. There's no question. To provide water to 9 billion people, even if we just keep steady the 2 billion people that currently don't have access to water, we'll use every tool that we have, and I suspect we'll use desal as well. I just wouldn't go there first because of cost. And I would be a little bit reluctant to think about that as a terrific idea on far inland cities. I mean, you're talking about becoming highly reliant on a single pipeline that's bringing your water to you. And I suspect that when cities really start to plan, the amount of water storage that they will have to create as an insurance policy against those pipelines breaking will also be extraordinarily expensive. The other thing about that, the other part of your question had to do with price of water, which is easily the most debated point on water on a global basis. And it really just has to do with your perspective on what water is. Is water a commodity? I mean, we've got water priced, and it's priced right now for treatment. So, somebody's paying the cost of treatment. We haven't priced the resource, is what's really being discussed. But we haven't priced air either. And so the question is, do we need to, is water more like air to where people have a right to clean air and clean water? Or do we have to treat it more like a commodity? And there are legitimate arguments here too, because right now, for example, global water losses in agriculture, as I mentioned earlier, are 30%. Well, they're 30% not because the technology isn't available. They're 30% because it is cheaper to waste the water than it is to invest in the infrastructure. And pricing water correctly would solve for that problem. So to me, you have to balance interest of humanity against motivating people not to waste the resource.
On that question, and I don't know the numbers, this is a real question, but I've heard that moving fracked oil or shale through pipelines takes a lot of water, and that it's basically not reusable, and that, for instance, if it comes here from Canada, it's just dirty soil and it gets dumped into the Gulf. And that I don't know how much water it takes to do that, but it sounds like a bad idea.
Well, here, the issue with fracking has to do with the amount of water that's used to frack in the first place. It's the water that's shot down into the pipes and moves over to break open those formations in the first place. What comes out is product, and that's what's put in pipelines that move across the country. So it's two separate issues. Here are the things that we need to think about with natural gas and fracking. And again, energy is about balancing risk versus just figuring out what's wrong with all of them, because they've all got fatal flaws if you go that route. But because fracking is considered a potential bridge fuel to the future, we do want to manage against the risks that are there. And what we want to pay attention to is the fact that it uses a lot of water. The Texas legislature this last session was one of the first states in the country that passed a disclosure law, so that people who are, the chemicals that go in that water now have to be disclosed. So you would even know what to test for. Before disclosure laws, we wouldn't have known what to test the groundwater for. And the third thing has to do with construction standards, because the problems that people are having have to do with casing breaking apart and with unlined water pits that the water goes into afterwards. And the truth of the matter is that really, really good and very enforced construction standards could go a long way. So I think, I don't know that adequately answers the question. I wouldn't say no to fracking just because it's extraordinarily inexpensive and it does offer some really, really nice alternatives. But you do want to mitigate against the risks that it does pose.
Well, aside from the polluting the ground level, does it take water to move it from, let us say, Canada to Texas?
It takes energy to move it. That's, moving anything through a pipeline takes an enormous amount of energy as well. Yes.
And does it also take water?
No, because it's product that's sitting in those pipelines.
You mean it's just petroleum at that point?
Yes. You've got some people from the energy industry here.
Well, I hope somebody will address it, because what I had understood was that the XL, for instance, was going to bring dirty stuff in and it would be refined here. And the dirty water would be discharged here, which kind of turns Texas into a third world country. If it's correct, and I don't know if it is.
I'll let anybody here that's from and I see several of you that are here from the energy industry might want to catch her after the program, but that's not my understanding. There are issues, and they're not the same issue. I do think this is worth saying. The issues vary depending on where you are in this country, and that's because the geologic formations vary depending on where you are in the country. So, for example, in Texas, the idea of groundwater contamination is somewhat mitigated just by how this state is put together with, this ground here, you've got groundwater here, and the product is far down and lays at a parallel to the groundwater. Now, that's a fundamentally different formation than what you have in other parts of the country where it's a diagonal, and you would have much stronger concerns about the interplay between fracking water and groundwater in those formations. Yes.
Laura, I appreciate your presentation. There's one thing I'd like to suggest to you that you might include. No one in Texas ever asked the question, do we want 50 million more people in the state of Texas? And if the answer is, well, maybe not, what does that mean for our planning efforts?
Is that rhetorical? I don't know how you, well, you know, I have a background in city management, so the idea of grow or don't grow is, you know, that's an active conversation at the local level. I think when you're planning for infrastructure, that's not the place where you can responsibly ask that question. That's my opinion. When you're planning for infrastructure, something as fundamental as water, something that would just completely clutch not just economies but families, I think you have to plan at least on the reasonably high side. And by the way, 50 million is not the high side of the estimates. 50 million is in the middle to the lower end of the demographic estimates for Texas, and I do think that's responsible. I wouldn't use the outlier number, but I don't know how you stop it. You know, we're a warm climate.
There are ways, but no one's looking at it, so we're not going to stop it or even address it. But you have to first recognize it and start talking about it. Nobody wants to talk about it. I participate in Region H water planning here. Nobody wants to talk about it.
I agree. People are planning for what's coming. Yes.
You were pointing out how important the Gulf is to us right now, and that the fresh water streams coming through the rivers are very important. As this drought continues, the cities up north of us are going to be recycling that water, and that stream is going to get less and less. I think there was a report out recently that the oyster beds near Corpus Christi are dead. I talked to Dr. Sammy Ray down in Texas A&M not long ago. He doesn't see any hope for the oyster seedings going on because of the lack of fresh water coming in here. That's one major problem that we have. We have to come up with another source of water other than depending on those rivers. Two other things that I wanted to mention. You mentioned fracking, but we still don't have full disclosure on the chemicals, and we don't know how badly it's impacting the water that's in the community. And I would suggest that we start looking at other forms of energy and not do things that'll destroy the water. The other one is that we don't talk about very much is a nuclear waste dump out in Andrews, Texas, that's very close to a major aquifer. When the fire came, it was very close to that. It could have atomized the nuclear waste over there. This is another major problem that we should be talking about. Thank you.
I'll tell you something interesting about the low flows in rivers and the salinity levels in the Gulf of Mexico is it absolutely does impact those oyster beds. And we've had a very close-up experience with that at the Nature Conservancy because part of our marine program is to replace those oyster beds, many of which were destroyed back in the 50s when people were building roads and it looked like good road base. Well, what science tells us today is they're nature's filtration system. Every oyster filters between 40 and 60 gallons of water a day. They're just an incredibly productive natural filtration system. And part of our marine program this summer was going to be to start replacing oyster reefs in the Gulf of Mexico. And the problem that we're facing right now is, you know, we may be ready to go and have all the plans, but if we put them in there, we're very concerned about whether or not they'll be productive. Very concerned.
Thank you very much for your presentation. You just mentioned earlier in response to another gentleman's question that step one should not be to increase more expensive water. And you also referenced during your presentation Coca-Cola's new program to replace every drop of water spent in making one of their products and saving that water somewhere else in around the globe. Now, Coca-Cola manufactures Dasani, which is nothing more than filtered tap water and maybe enriched with some minerals, as well as for a bunch of other companies. And while bottled water is necessary for regions of the globe that don't have access to clean water, it is sold at 200,000% above production value. Now, that's economically unsustainable and it wastes energy. So are there any changes that you foresee or that you recommend that need to be taken in order to deal with the ways we currently consume water, even by drinking, for example?
So are you asking me, should beverage companies stop bottling water in order? I'm sure.
Yes.
Let me give you a perspective on that, because I actually heard the CEO of Hershey get asked that exact question, and I'll tell you what his response is, and you can decide how you feel about it. His response was that he had a pretty strong reaction from the following standpoint. He said, every beverage that we produce requires water, a significant amount of water, and you are buying Coke and those products by the truckload. Why is it that you don't ask the question, when I put a half a cup of sugar in it? Why is it that when it's sold without that sugar and without that coloring, all of a sudden it's a water supply issue? That was his answer, so I just want to share that with you because I thought it was thought-provoking. The other thing is, bottled water is not competing with public water systems, and we shouldn't think of it that way. Bottled water is a luxury. It is not what we're trying, it's certainly not a part of the state's water plan, it's not part of any responsible water plan. Having public water supplies is all about systems. It's all about having water that moves through pipelines and comes out of taps. It's not about the bottled water industry. Now, could they make a show? Probably. But I'm not sure that, every beverage that we all buy and drink requires a lot of water. So I thought he made a pretty good point when he talked about whether or not flavoring it and making it sweeter fundamentally changed that conversation. And what I think that they're doing that is interesting, and I think the reason why we don't want to beat too hard on the food and beverage industry is this. They are the innovators in this arena. They wake up every morning and they look at what's called water scarcity maps. And they look at the entire world in terms of water availability now and into the future. And they can't afford to be in places that haven't thought about water. And so they're on the front end of thinking about how we protect those supplies. And frankly, in this, I work for an organization that is, more interested in finding practical on-the-ground solutions than on figuring out where the angles are for having arguments over issues. And I think working with that industry on creative strategies and then taking government a low-risk solution that helps get to scale is probably a good idea.
Hi. It's an unfortunate reality in Texas that we're kind of lag behind when it comes to environmental issues or things that are perceived as environmental issues, and so I feel like for Texas we really require some federal impetus to push us on to permitting. Is there anything regarding Conservancy on the federal level, an agency that could possibly require the state of Texas to take a more fund the programs that they're talking about?
Sure, and I mean, you all read the newspapers, so those arguments have already shaped up over the last year. Let me offer you a framework for thinking about that issue, because I think what has happened with the concept of conservation and the environment in our country is that we've left behind some incredibly important aspects of this movement that, by the way, used to be joyful and nonpartisan, and it's called protection. There were periods in our history where we went out and we identified places that had unique, environmental attributes, and we set them aside and protected them. And that protection is what I worry more about, to be very honest with you. And we don't want to reduce the entire spectrum of conservation and environment to just air. We want to be really, really careful about that. The state of Texas hasn't invested in conservation in land since the late 1980s. The federal government is essentially out of the business. And so, we're looking at huge landscapes and a lot of growth that I think needs to be a part of the discussion that you're having. And I think that part of how we can take the heat out of these very important issues is to pull back and remember that it was, this arena didn't used to be just an exclusive discussion about regulation. And the fact that it has just become what I call the Jerry Springer show, that is a function of the fact that all we're discussing is regulation. So the answer to your question is yes. You can impose a lot of things through levels of government. The federal government can impose things on the state can impose things on local governments. And more of that may be needed, but I think more importantly, what more is needed is a broader look at what conservation is about. And I think my example about energy shows you a path. Why are we going to go in there and figure out what's wrong with every form of energy and still insist on having lights turned on? Why aren't we going to figure out how to mitigate our risk and have a balanced portfolio. So the answer to your question is yes, but I'd encourage all of us to pull back and have a broader perspective on what conservation is. And by the way, that's why I do this. You know, it's about real places. I'll go over here.
My question has to do with water as a worldwide issue. You mentioned that it's all over the world, so as other parts of the world tackle these issues, and especially in developing countries, there's often technologies that are cheaper and more efficient, especially in terms of water purification. So how do you see this tying into solutions in Texas?
Cheaper systems that are available?
Yeah, cheaper and maybe more efficient.
I think we'll use every technology that we can get our hands on. I mean, look, the truth of the matter is we're only treating the amount of water that the state needs today. And as treatment costs come down, this state will adopt and probably even innovate in that arena. I would say this, that we want to be careful about comparing highly urbanized water systems in cities like Houston, which is going to be a mega city if it isn't already, with very, very cheap technology that is available in a village in Africa. Totally different systems. One solution does not work for another. There are nonprofits and there are organizations that are set up in parts of the world that are really, really rural, and those well investments, for example, can go a long way. There's some very inexpensive filtering that you can do in those small systems, but that wouldn't work for a city like Houston. So there are going to be some, urbanized solutions and some rural solutions. Desal is a good example. I believe that, Texas is already using desal. Corpus Christi has a desal plant. El Paso has a desal plant. So we'll be early innovators in that, and we'll be early adopters of technology that's available, partly because we're growing faster than most other parts of the country.
Yes. As you well know, the city of San Antonio and surrounding areas are blessed with an incredibly large amount of wonderful groundwater in the Edwards Aquifer. However, it seems to me that the city of San Antonio and those areas have been forced, I guess, to diversify their source, not only for drought proofing, but also because of the endangered species legislation. It has, become mandatory to keep Comal Springs, so forth, at a certain level. I've often wondered if there was a way to, in this era of dwindling water supplies, would there be a way to satisfy the environmental community and, for the critters to live without making such an incredible sacrifice, because it is obviously a huge financial sacrifice?
Well, a couple of comments. San Antonio still relies entirely on the Edwards Aquifer. They don't have a secondary source of water. And while I give San Antonio a lot of credit for their protection of their water supply through land conservation, one of the things that people in San Antonio, including their mayor, wake up thinking about every morning is a diversified water portfolio. And so they have actively, at least for the last decade, pursued surface water. Actually, they were pursuing surface water in the late 80s. It's just that the voters voted it down. So they're not paying the cost of any of that right now. San Antonio has taken a different perspective on this. The perspective that they've taken is that aquifer. The good news about the Edwards Aquifer is it's like Swiss cheese, man. That thing fills up so fast in a rain. The bad news is whatever's running through the streets of San Antonio and across that aquifer is going straight into the aquifer as well. So they have focused, instead of focusing on environmental protection standards, they've really focused on making sure that the aquifer is clean when rain does fall. No, I don't think that they have taken a look at how they can argue, about whether or not those flow levels are appropriate. And in many cases, I think that, the 90s are where a lot of those arguments were fought. I was working in San Marcos at the time, and, we were at the wrong end of the aquifer if you're a small city behind a big city. So we had lots of concerns about a growing population's use of a single source of water and being a really small city. And in Central Texas, it's still one of the only conjunctive water use cities, which is a city that uses both groundwater and surface water.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. One more question?
The whole context in which you put this entire problem is that there are just so darn many of us. and there are quickly becoming more and more people on Earth. And without straying into anything as sort of scary and Orwellian and authoritative as like what China has going on with the single-child law, do you think that do you think that it's the province of conservation to think about population growth and to think about ways of changing the culture of population growth?
I should have had a caveat that no Rice students could ask questions, and certainly not previous Nature Conservancy interns. No, I absolutely do not believe that conservation organizations should enter into that arena. We should do what we do well, which is to cultivate field science that asks some basic questions about what targets are out there and how we can practically protect them. That's what we're good at. And there are other organizations that are out there that are suited and staffed and have the correct kind of leadership to have that other debate. So I say stick to what you're good at, and there are people out there that can and will and are having that debate.
I think we're going to draw this to a close. And if anyone has any more questions, I think Laura would entertain you coming up and talking with her about them privately.
Thank you so much. You guys have been a wonderful audience. Yeah.